Hey there, and welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. I'm going to do this just a little differently this week. I am doing another viewer request. And it's not so much based on something taken from the message here at Sunday Slope this past week, but from an adult ed class that I've been teaching. And I think it has some actual relevance for our current situation, for our current day. And so I thought I would do this. So we've been looking and we've been going through we talked yesterday about the topic of God's sovereignty. And simply put, that's the question of how does God interact and engage with the world around us? How do the events of this world come to pass? And to what extent does God have control over the events? And that always raises a tough question, because there is so much pain and suffering and heartache in this world. There's so much in the world that might lead us to conclude that that God is not really in control, or if he is in control, his power is limited. And so what I want to do today is maybe just summarize a little bit. What do we mean when we talk about his will or his sovereignty over creation? And then I want to focus on how that relates to worry, because if you're like me, there are things that you worry about. And for some people, the list of things that you worry about is rather lengthy. And so how can the idea of God's sovereignty, how can that help us with our worry? I'm going to put real quick here. I'm going to share my screen. Theologians and biblical scholars talk about really at least two aspects to God's sovereignty, or to his will. And this can be helpful in making sense of why God allows certain things to happen. The first thing that we talk about is God's permissive will. That is to say that there are a lot of things that God allows to happen that he might not approve of, right? There are things that God permits, but he doesn't necessarily commands. And the most obvious example of that would be human sinfulness and human brokenness. Why is it that people are able to commit some horrible crimes? Why is it that people are allowed to be guilty of violent acts against other people, hurting people in a marriage or in a family? If God is sovereign, if God is sovereign and in control, why does he allow that? And the answer is that God permits those things. He permits those things in this world, and it's really ultimately an expression of his love. Now, when I say that, I don't want to minimize the pain of the effects that sin and brokenness can have in our world, but think of it this way. God's greatest desire and the greatest expression of love is obedience that is freely offered to God. I use this example in my Sunday school class. If my wife came to me and told me and gave me the money and demanded that I go to the store and pick her up some flowers and bring them home, I might very well do that, but giving those to my wife would not really be that much of an expression of love, because I'm simply following orders, and you might say my choice is fairly limited. Now, I realize that's maybe a fairly, rough example, but it gets at this idea of what does God really want from us? And what he wants is for us to freely offer him obedience. He wants us to freely serve him, worship him, and to freely do this with others. Now, in order for that to be possible, it must also be possible for us not to do that. So the fact that we can make a moral choice is because God gives us that freedom. He permits us to do right, but he also permits us to do what is wrong. the consequence again that comes with that is that many times people do choose to do what is wrong, but that still happens under the umbrella of God's sovereignty. That happens under the umbrella of God's will. The fact that evil exists in this world does not negate the fact that God is sovereign. It just means that God permits it. Now, I'll be the first to admit that there are plenty of things that God permits that I don't understand. I don't understand why God permits some of the things that he does. But my understanding doesn't negate the idea that God indeed permits it. The second aspect of God's will is what theologians call God's decreed will. And there's really two parts to that. One part of it, we talk about God's, what God tells us we ought to do, how he tells us we ought to live. And we often think right away about the 10 Commandments, for example. God's will is that we not murder, and that we not steal, and that we not commit adultery, and that we not misuse his name and worship other gods and worship him in ways that he's not commanded. That is God's decreed will. That's one aspect of it. But there again, there's even his decreed will overlaps with his permissive will, because he permits us to do those things or not to do those things, right? So he decrees that I am not to steal, but he also allows for the freedom for me to steal. But there's another aspect, and that's what I want to focus us on. That is God's decreed will also is his declaration, or that all things in creation are being brought to his appointed goal. God is in the process. He has said that all of creation will be redeemed in such a way that one day everything is made new and the curse is entirely removed from all of creation. And so his decree is that he's bringing everything to this climactic conclusion in Christ. And there is no question that that will happen. God has declared it. He has said it. He has insisted that all of history is working towards a climactic conclusion and a redemptive conclusion in Christ. And God has declared that, and he has said that, and that will indeed happen. Now, we talk about this all as God's providence. I'm kind of relating God's will to his providence. God permits things to happen, but this reflects God's engagement with his world. These are examples of how God is involved and how he interacts with his creation. In other words, we can be assured and we can be confident that God is, no matter what evidence we might see that suggest otherwise, we can be assured and we can be certain that God remains firmly in control of all creation. And this is meant to give us a reason for gratitude, because it reminds us that everything that we have is a gift from God. It's meant to help us be patient when life isn't going the way that we want, when times are tight, money is tight, relationships are strained, you don't get the job that you had applied for and hoped to get, and the relationship maybe comes to an end, or your children are choosing a path that is discouraging and disheartening to you. There's all kinds of ways that life doesn't go the way that you might want. Your car breaks down, you don't have the money for the repair, you don't get a tax refund this year, right? All kinds of things. And the assurance that God remains in control is meant to help us be patient, even when things do not go well. And furthermore, big picture, this is meant to point us to the idea that God is absolutely and firmly in control of every molecule and every galaxy. He oversees and orchestrates every millisecond and every millennium to his appointed end. He is most assuredly bringing everything to his ultimate goal and ultimate purpose. And that means that even the worst things that can happen to us, God is able in his power to turn them around in the long term and use them for good. Now, that brings us to the question of worry, because on the one hand, you might believe that this is true. We might affirm that we believe that God is in control and that he's bringing all things to his appointed goal in Christ. And yet Many of us live with worry. Many of us, you worry about how are you going to pay the bills next month. You worry about what happens when you have to pay for your kids' college. What happens when it comes time to retire? You worry about people that you love and care for, who maybe are, in harm's way in some way. If you're a parent, you worry about your kids and their health and their safety. And if you aren't careful, worry can sort of come to consume you. Worry there's sort of two kinds of worry. There's an appropriate care and concern for people and for circumstances. It would be strange if you said, I never really had any concern about my kids and their health and their well-being. No good parent is indifferent to the well-being of their children. They have concern. They want to make sure their kids are healthy and that they're well adjusted and that they have friends. I mean, these are legitimate concerns. But worry is what happens when unwittingly we begin to take on the role of God. In other words, it's or maybe a better way to say it is that worry is what happens when our limited abilities, when we become aware of our limited abilities. We worry because ultimately, if you are wanting your kids to succeed in life, you want them to get into a good college and you want them to get a career and you want them to, find their way in life, or you worry about your future. You want to make sure that you have enough saved up in your retirement and that the market does okay so that you are able to, pull money out of your retirement account when it comes time. And worrying about that is really, you are focusing on the future, and you are, in a sense, you're trying to claim for yourself what ultimately only God may do, right? In other words, our future is meant to rest entirely in God's hands. And when we worry about it all the time, what we're really doing is that there's sort of this tension between the fact that we know we need to be concerned for the future, but we also recognize that we are limited in the control that we have over our future. And so worry stems from from our own finiteness, just kind of butting up against circumstances. And that's really what worry is all about. Worry is so often traced back to just the simple reality that we are limited people. We are limited in our ability to have control. We are limited in our ability to exercise, to influence the outcome of a given situation. I want to put something up here. This is what John Calvin says about worry. And I love how he says this because it's honest. Now he's writing in his time, but the quote will make sense. He says, "Embark upon a ship, you are one step away from death. Mount a horse. If one foot slips, your life is imperiled. Go through the city streets, you are subject to as many dangers as there are tiles on the roofs. If there is a weapon in your hand or a friend's, harm awaits. All the fierce animals you see are armed for your destruction." In other words, Calvin says the world is an incredibly dangerous place. There's all these things that you might not even be aware of, and your demise is one horse away who decides to buck at just the wrong time, or your injury is just one roof tile that flies off the roof in a storm. Your death could be one fierce and angry animal away from attacking you. So Calvin is really saying, you know what, we live in this very dangerous world. He says there's plenty of reasons that we should be worried. Then he goes on, he says, okay, well, if you want to shut yourself up in a walled garden, seemingly delightful. In other words, if you want to just hunker down in your own house, there a serpent sometimes lies hidden. Your house, continually in danger of fire, threatens in the daytime to impoverish you, at night even to collapse upon you. Your field, since it is exposed to hail, frost, drought, and other calamities, threatens you with barrenness and hence famine. I pass over poisonings, ambushes, robberies, open violence, which in part besiege us at home, in part dog us abroad. Amid these tribulations, must not man be most miserable, since but half alive in life, he weakly draws his anxious and languid breath as if he had a sword perpetually hanging over his neck? In other words, what Calvin is saying is that if you want to worry, what you're really trying to do for yourself is you're trying to take control over your own health and safety and well-being. And if you want to do that, then your problem isn't that you worry that you worry too much. Your problem is that you aren't worried enough. He says if you want to claim control and sovereignty over, if you want to take the role of providing for your own well-being, then you better start paying attention to all these other possibilities that can threaten you and bring harm into your life. He says there are countless things that we aren't even aware of that can do us in. And it's true. I mean, you drive down the freeway, how many times are there that a driver could sideswipe you, or you could just simply not see a car coming and you're in an accident? Or how many times, how many people are there that you walk past that could want to do you some harm? The reality is we live in on the one sense, we live in a world where there's all these possible threats to our well-being. The problem is, it's not that we don't, that we worry too much. Calvin would say we don't worry enough. But here's the thing, and this is what's crucial. This is not meant to make you worry more. It's meant to say that for all of these things and the many more things that we don't even think of, the antidote to worry is to acknowledge that our lives really must be entirely in God's hands. And God is faithful to us. God actually provides and protects us far more than we realize. He grants us safety in ways that that we aren't even aware of. And therefore, we have every reason to be confident that God will continue to do so. Now, there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees on, how many years of life you're going to get. There's no guarantees that an illness won't come. But there is a guarantee that your life rests firmly secure in the hands of God. And the question is, what kind of a God do we serve? And if the scriptures are true, and our God is a God who actually enters into the greatest experience of pain and brokenness and human selfishness and anger and animosity, and he uses that to and he redeems that, he enters into that in order to redeem this world, then we have every reason to trust that God can take even the worst circumstances in our own life and use them and turn them around to accomplish his good purpose. So the antidote to worry, I mean, very practically speaking, of course, is prayer. Philippians chapter 4 talks about that. Therefore, do not be anxious about anything, but in prayer and petition, make your requests known to God. That's Philippians chapter 4. The antidote, and what you're really doing is you're actually acknowledging that your life is not in your control. The antidote to worry is the prayer of acknowledging and trusting the sovereignty of God. It's actually prayerfully coming to God and saying, Lord, my life is not in my hands. You are in control. You are firmly watching over every molecule and millisecond of my life, every galaxy and every millennia that passes by. Everything is completely in God's hands. And so prayerfully, that's what we're meant to do. That's where I'm going to end it today. That's a little bit on worry. That's a biblical perspective on worry. And we'll see you next time. Hope this has been helpful for you, and leave a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll do it again next time. All right. Thanks for watching. Bye.